The Sega Genesis Mini has managed to garner a lot of mainstream attention, and it looks like it's shaping up to be a high-quality product, poised to have a very successful run. The Mini console has been available for pre-order for a few weeks now, and though it doesn't come out until September, it's already the 120th highest-selling product on Amazon.com. Sega fans and the gaming press have taken notice, and it's led a lot of people to wonder, could Sega release even more retro plug-and-plays? What about a Sega CD Mini, or even a Sega Saturn Mini? Lending credence to this notion is a recent Famitsu magazine interview with Sega's Chief Content Officer, Hiroyuki Miyazaki, in which he explicitly states that Sega would be open to the idea of developing more mini consoles, if the Mini is successful. He even mentions the Sega CD and the Saturn by name. That's exciting news for Sega fans, but just how big a hit would the Sega Genesis Mini have to be for this to occur, and what are the real chances it could happen? I've been looking at the numbers, and I have to say, it doesn't look very likely at all. You can quote me on this. I don't believe there is ever going to be a Sega CD, a 32X, or a Sega Saturn Mini dedicated console. Ever. Never. Why? For Sega to actually go ahead with another mini console, doing so needs to stand a chance of being very profitable. Investing in the large amount of capital and resources needed to produce a line of miniature dedicated plug-and-play consoles is extremely risky, especially for a company like Sega that hasn't been in the hardware game for a long time. They have to pay to design it, outsource the development and emulation, then they need to find a way to actually build it, pack it, ship it, advertise it, and then they also need a full-time team of people able to negotiate all of this and actually get the thing brought to market. It's an enormously complex, expensive, and time-consuming undertaking that would need a huge payoff in order to make the reasonable return on the investment. And if you've been following the news, then you already realize a big return on an investment is something that Sega desperately needs right now, since their profits are down a woeful 70% over the last year. It's a good thing for Sega that a Sega Genesis Mini done right, done the way that they've been doing it, is going to be a very good bet. And the real reason for this isn't just the fact that they're going with an interesting catalog of well-emulated games, but it also has to do with the fact that the Sega Genesis was one of the most successful and recognizable pieces of hardware of the 80s and 90s. Selling over 30 million units, the Genesis, for a time, was even able to put Sega ahead of industry leader Nintendo, at least in the United States. This achievement cemented it as a fondly remembered and unavoidable part of youth culture for an entire generation. Put simply, the Sega Genesis is truly iconic in every sense of the word. But even the Sega Genesis, for all of its greatness, pales in comparison to the cultural superstar that is the Nintendo Entertainment System. Though much older and technologically inferior in every way, the NES ruled the 80s and produced a monstrous library of games, many of which are still treasured to this very day. And while the Sega Genesis sold an impressive 30 million consoles in its lifetime, the NES sold a staggering 61.9 million units, making it not just a well-loved gaming console from the 80s and 90s, but one of the most recognizable pieces of pop culture across any medium, ever. The NES, along with Michael Jackson, the Rubik's Cube, and giant hairbands, essentially defines the image of what life was like for millions of people living in the 1980s. So the NES Classic, which came out in 2016, seems like a kind of no-brainer, but even Nintendo couldn't have guessed how popular it would really be. Selling out immediately, it became the hottest toy of the Christmas season. To date, the NES Classic has sold over 3.8 million units, and while that's only 5.8% of the 61.9 million units the actual NES sold over its long lifetime, it was enough to make the entire video game industry stop and take notice. Now these retro mini consoles are pouring onto the market like crazy. There was the SNES Classic in 2017, which sold even better. And then there was the miniature Commodore 64, the Neo Geo, the PlayStation Classic. And though many of these have come out to mixed reviews, nostalgic retro gamers still seem to want them. But not just anyone will buy them. We're talking about the people who most fondly remember and love these things. These are nostalgia items for longtime fans, and that's the insurmountable problem facing any future miniature retro console that would be done by Sega. In short, the Sega CD and the Sega Saturn simply weren't big enough or popular enough to warrant such a costly investment as a miniature console. Given the sales records of current retro consoles, if we were being optimistic, then we can expect the Sega Genesis Mini to sell roughly 5% as well as the actual Sega Genesis. If my guess is right, then that means we can expect Sega to sell around 1.5 million Genesis Minis. While that's not quite as impressive as the NES Classic, it's a figure that essentially smashes all the other plug-and-play competitors out of the water. And given the amount of care Sega has given this project, unlike Sony's cash grab, I fully expect this to be the outcome. The Sega Genesis Mini is destined to be a hit. But when we look at the past sales numbers for consoles like the Sega CD or the Sega Saturn, there's much less reason to be optimistic. The Sega CD was a costly add-on to the Sega Genesis that came out with a paltry 166 games in the US. On top of that, few of those games did anything to warrant a purchase. The consequence of this is a flop that sold a mere 2.2 million units, a small fraction of the 30 million units ultimately achieved by the Sega Genesis. As with the NES Classic and all the other miniatures, we can't expect the limited nostalgia market to be much bigger than about 5% of the actual Sega CD's real historic sales. Therefore, even being optimistic and assuming a polished, well-publicized product, a Sega CD Mini wouldn't sell much more than 112,000 units, which is far, far too few to justify all of the expensive costs required to develop it and bring it to the market. The same can be said for the Sega Saturn. While it performed much better than the Sega CD, it still only sold just less than a third of as many units as the Sega Genesis worldwide. Similar to the Sega CD, there was a small list of worthwhile games ever produced for the console, especially for the US market, and to make matters worse, much worse, acceptable emulation of the complicated Sega Saturn hardware has yet to be really achieved, even in 2019. Given the extremely high likelihood that neither a Sega CD Mini or a Sega Saturn Mini would ever be able to break past 1 million sales, I think it's safe to say that we won't ever see either of them in the form of a miniature console. However, this doesn't mean that Sega doesn't have other options, nor does it mean Sega won't ever produce another mini console. There are some great Saturn and Sega CD games that could make great additions to the Sega Ages line on the Nintendo Switch. Who doesn't want to see a quality port of, say, Virtua Fighter 2 or Panzer Dragoon, or even Panzer Dragoon Saga? But one option no one's really talking about, that I do think we really might actually see, if the Sega Genesis Mini does well, and it's going to, is for a Sega Master System Mini. M2, the development company handling the emulation of the Sega Genesis Mini, has already worked on 16 great games for that console, and unlike the Sega CD or the Saturn, the Master System actually sold fairly well worldwide, and it has a remarkably loyal fan community. For gamers in Europe and Brazil, it was actually the Sega Master System that defined the console gaming in the 80s and 90s, not the Nintendo. Over the course of its long life, the Master System managed to sell over 13 million units worldwide. If my guess about the size of the retro market is correct, and it's developed with an eye for quality, then the Master System Mini could sell more than 500,000 units. Perhaps it could even sell more than 1 million units. I wouldn't expect it to sell anywhere near what I'm expecting for the Sega Genesis Mini, but enough, perhaps to make the venture worthwhile. Plus, the Master System has a library of mostly first-party Sega games, which means you can put together a comprehensive library without having to worry too much about licensing issues. And though the library is small and the system isn't as well remembered, there were quite a few quality games on that platform for people to enjoy. For many people, the Master System, more than anything else, essentially defines the term Sega. I'd get one. Would you? So, what do you all predict will happen? Is Sega going to follow in step with Nintendo and make a follow-up to the Sega Genesis Mini? And do you think we're right in thinking that it will be a Master System instead of a Sega CD or a Saturn? Let us know what you think in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.